Well, hello, and I'm not sure if I'm welcoming Dr. Suneel Dhand or he's welcoming me because we plan to put this on both channels. It's not the views that are important on a particular channel, it's getting this important message out. But Suneel, thank you. Great to see you again.
Oh, absolute pleasure, John. Good to be back with you.
Now, this was triggered really by Robert Kennedy Jr.'s speech. I've written it down, MAHA, Make America Healthy Again.
Yeah.
And I did say on the interview I did with Neil Oliver on this, once he's done that, he'll be more than welcome in the United Kingdom because we've got a few problems as well. So, for example, ultra-processed foods in the United States, probably at least 60% of the calorie intake in the States. And I didn't think we were quite as bad in the United Kingdom, but a survey from the British Medical Journal has actually put it at ultra-processed foods as 56.8% of total energy intake in the United Kingdom. Of course, this has got huge implications, but as a physician, you see lots of diseases that are related to lifestyle. What is the main messages and the main links, do you think, between lifestyle, of which nutrition, of course, is a huge part, and well-being and disease?
Well, I think the link is just about as strong as can be. And the interesting thing is that you go back 2,500 years to what Hippocrates was writing before we even had any of the modern technology and ability to look at data. And he said the same thing, that anybody's health and well-being is rooted in primarily what they eat. Obviously, there are other holistic pillars, but nothing comes before what you eat. And as a practicing physician, I've been in the United States for many years now, and there is a trend culturally, which I'm sure you and the viewers are familiar with. Whatever happens in the US tends to come to the UK very fast. These trends catch on very quickly. The UK is almost a satellite of the US. So I must say, in all my years of being in the US, even when I first moved here 15 or so years ago, America was not known for, let's say, being a thin, healthy country. But still, it was something which wasn't entirely off the charts when I got here. But something very strange has happened over the last 10 years, and particularly the last 5 years. I would say catastrophe is not a strong enough word. We have something brewing right now which is off the charts, and it's truly unprecedented in terms of the health disaster it's created. And the UK is really not that far behind. Every time I come back to the UK, I come back every few months, my family is there, and I notice that the metabolic health of people visibly, everything I'm seeing and hearing from my doctor colleagues in the UK is not that far behind. And I would say, just sort of as an underline to what we want to focus on, the main reason for this is the addiction to cheap, ultra-processed foods and a complete change to the food environment over the last few decades, which is truly unprecedented.
So I would see things roughly in three categories. Some people would say four categories. I'd say unprocessed food or natural food, the way God made it. So it's you pick it from a tree, or you pick the plant, or you eat part of an animal, or you eat an egg. They're natural, unprocessed products. And then there's sort of semi-processed foods, where you might add an ingredient or two or preserve it in some way. But then we have this. So some people would add an extra category of partly processed spices and cooking accompaniments like that. But really, what we're worried about is this ultra-processed food. And my thinking of this has developed really quite recently to thinking that another way to describe this would be industrialized or industrial produced food. Very often with multiple components, very often with components in the diet that have in the overall preparation of the food, in inverted commas, that have been messed around with, for want of a better term. Maybe the vegetable oils have been hydrogenated, or extra fructose has been added. So we can have dodgy ingredients put together in disproportionate ways, churned through a factory, and then we end up with this product which kind of looks like food and maybe even tastes like food, but actually, in a real sense, isn't food. Is that how you see ultra processed food?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent description. Mass industrially produced food that we are not designed to eat. This is very, very new, which is why we're seeing an unprecedented health disaster. And I believe that the line between processed food, which is maybe what I had occasionally when I was a young boy growing up in my village in England, where there would be like two or three ingredients, but there wouldn't be 17 ingredients like there are now. And now we've moved much more to these industrially produced foods that are just absolutely packed. And what I'd like to impart, if our viewers here don't already do this, once you get into the habit of reading ingredient labels, you can't stop, because this is when you're woken up to this, and now it's a habit. And people in my family have started doing this as well, because you think, my goodness, what's being added to the food? And we can't really trust that authorities have properly vetted everything. So you mentioned a few key things there. You're looking for sugars, which are added in ridiculous amounts, often under different names, syrups, etc. You have other additives, which are highly pro-inflammatory. You have seed oils. In the US, there's 3 or 4 seed oils, which are used a lot. In the UK, I believe the major one is rapeseed oil. We call it canola oil over here. And you have to bear in mind that this is something, all of what I just talked about, are ingredients that we're simply not built for. And it should come as no surprise that when we're consuming vast quantities, those statistics that you actually cited, I've seen even worse than that. In the US, for example, ultra-processed foods are now over 70% of all calorie intake. And in poor communities, this is a kicker, over 90%, because it's cheap, industrially produced, highly addictive. UK, I believe 60+%. And what a sea change, because our grandparents and great-grandparents, it was almost 0%. They ate real food. And this might taste good, of course it is, because the same scientists that worked for big tobacco have now gone over to big food, and they deliberately make it addictive, like something like a packet of Doritos. Tastes good. Yeah, of course it does. I'm human. I'm going to find it tastes good as well, but it's been deliberately synthesized to make you keep on eating it. And it's an addiction situation now for millions of people, sadly, who think this is food, think it's been vetted, but it's actually not. It's what I term frankenfood.
And then when people feel hungry, because they associate that with the last fix, as it were, the last satisfaction of the addiction, they look for that same food again, to partly because they're hungry, but also to fulfill the addiction of these ingredients in the food that are actually designed to be addictive, to get you hooked on to a particular food. I mean, what do you think the motivation of people is, or industries are, that are making these foods? Do you think they've got our best health interests in mind, or do you think they've got other motivations for the way they're producing these foods?
Well, I think quite simply, if we look at the situation in the US, and I'm sure that the UK has a similar kind of industrial structure, the bottom line is make as much money as possible, and everybody needs food. These are trillion-dollar industries. Everybody has to keep buying the product over and over. It's a good business model. And then they keep making this food industrially produced. They cut the prices, make it cheaper, pile all this absolute junk into it, and more people buy it. And sadly, it's the poorer people who end up worse affected. And we're at a unique point in history where throughout history, being overweight and obese was always a rich man's problem. But now it's more of a poor man's problem. And it's so sad. I see it every day in the US when I walk past grocery stores, convenience stores, and you see the poorest people coming out with this absolute junk, often with their kids. And you know, or I know what's going to happen next as a doctor.
And we've all seen this in supermarkets. You know, we've watched people, what they put into the shopping, and the child's asking for a particular product. And you can see that this is an appalling, essentially toxic, ultra-processed product that the child at a very young age has become essentially addicted to. And then when you have children round and you try and feed them some sensible food, maybe some vegetables and some eggs and some meat, they sort of turn their nose up because they're so programmed to eat this appalling industrialized food with incredible health consequences for later in life.
Exactly, and I love that word. It is appalling, and it's funny. I often say history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I believe that there was a very similar situation with cigarettes and tobacco in the 1960s and 70s. Everyone used to smoke. Doctors used to smoke on ward rounds. Patients used to be given cigarettes. There was a complete ignorance of what is happening. I actually truly believe that this situation is orders of magnitude worse than smoking. And let me tell you why. With smoking, it took years to develop health problems. When did you ever see a teenager with lung cancer or another problem? It took decades. But you are seeing teenagers now with type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease, which has never happened before. So, in some ways, weighing up two evils, I'm not encouraging smoking by any stretch of the imagination, but I believe ultra processed foods are far worse. They're making people way sicker. If you look back to the 60s and 70s, complete ignorance from the medical establishment and mainstream media, who were often paid off by cigarette companies, they held out for as long as possible before they finally realized the damage that's being done. And you're seeing the same things now. But I am worried that by the time the dam breaks, because it will, no mistake, John, break, because this is going to bring down entire nations, you can't have a situation now like in the US where 50% of all children are overweight or obese, and 20% of them have fatty liver disease, which no pediatrician ever saw. Think of what this is going to be in 10 years' time. I worry that we're going to realize, and I worry that the medical system, which in the US is incentivized to actually make money from sick people, especially younger people, so there's no incentive from the top to fix this problem. But when we do eventually realize, I'm worried that it's going to be too late.
We are really dealing with an epidemic in both our countries, well, the United States and the United Kingdom, all the developed countries really, and indeed, I think we could say a pandemic. This is something that's affecting the whole world. Now, malnutrition to me, mal, of course, clinically, that just means abnormal, doesn't it? Malnutrition. Right. And to me, malnutrition takes two forms. When people say malnutrition, they tend to think of these horrible pictures we might get of horribly malnourished, starving children, which is wretched and of course is a form of malnutrition. But we can also have malnutrition which is overnutrition, eating too much of something. So we've mentioned that eating too many seed oils, for example. Now, these are often oils which are produced from relatively healthy oils to begin with, but then they're processed at very high temperatures, changing the chemical nature to trans fats, changing the effect that it has on the body. So we have too much of these. We have too much sugar, definitely too much sugar, especially things like high fructose products. And also we're eating things in food that we shouldn't be eating at all, like emulsifiers and colouring agents and thickeners and flavours and things like that. So I think a lot of the malnutrition that we're actually seeing is overnutrition from certain specific components of the diet. Do you think that's a reasonable way to look at the obesity problem, for example?
Yeah, it is, and that's a really good point. And frequently, it's so interesting because as a frontline doctor, I will see patients that are overweight or obese, and we will check their blood tests, and they'll have a low protein and low albumin level, showing signs of malnutrition, which just shows. Firstly, I don't consider a lot of this real food. I believe it was Professor Robert Lustig who said that the object of eating should be to feed your gut and protect your liver. But actually, what we're doing is we're destroying our gut and destroying our liver at the same time with these foods. And they're not nourishing us. They're not protecting our gut microbiome. They're causing a lot of inflammation, which is leading to immune disease, cancers even. We've had a 500% increase in childhood gastrointestinal cancers in the last couple of decades.
Wow.
Now, I think there may be a few factors that have gone into this. I think a few things during the pandemic have contributed as well. However, This was actually a trend before the pandemic. We were seeing it, and this is why I'm so concerned. And you would not believe how perverse the incentives are in the US. You have to see it to believe it. But venture capital is now most excited by chemotherapy infusion clinics, and they're actually heavily investing in chemotherapy clinics across the US. And the medical establishment is kind of jumping on board, but not asking the question, why are younger and younger people getting cancer? And to me and many other doctors, it's very obvious our bodies are being plowed with these toxic foods. Let's not forget as well the pesticides as well, which are being used. I mean, at every stage of the process. So obviously, if you're putting those in your gut is going to react. And it's just astonishing that doctors aren't waking up more. And I actually think every doctor personally, if they really care and they remember why they went into medicine, should be waking up in a cold sweat every night, wondering what's going on, because 80% of everything we're seeing is due to insulin resistance and inflammation from a toxic food environment. It's astonishing that we think the answer is to pile more medicines or give people semaglutide. I mean, had this catastrophe happened in the 1970s, where doctors had more sense eventually and said, you have to stop smoking, I worry that if we had the same mentality then, they would have said, oh, it's okay, keep on smoking, we'll just put this filter in your lung, or we'll just inject you with something every month. It's a ludicrous situation, not focusing on the root cause.
Smoking could be a good opportunity for people that make anti-cancer drugs, and cancer is a good business opportunity, sadly.
It is, as is the diabetes industry, yep.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you raised that question there about agrochemicals. So pesticides, herbicides, and as well as that, a lot of artificial fertilizers as well. Robert Kennedy, in his interview, said that there's a lot of agrochemicals that are allowed in the States that actually get into the food. Now, in the UK, it's bad enough. But apparently in the States, there's even more chemicals which aren't allowed in Europe that actually get into the food. So you have this ludicrous situation where we might say to people, look, go and eat fresh food. So they go into a supermarket and there's maybe some nice fresh apples or some strawberries. But of course, they could be actually contaminated with these agrochemicals. It makes it really difficult, and it's an extra layer of really contamination in our food, as well as these industrialized so-called food products. We have these synthetic chemicals which are there to optimize production and therefore optimize profit. So there's a couple of things to be concerned about, really.
Yeah, and this makes it more difficult because I'm giving advice here: go as pure as possible, consume food, cook from scratch, buy natural food, food from God, from nature, whatever you believe in, and eat what your great-grandparents ate. But then we know at the same time that it's probably laced with pesticides and chemicals. I do think the rules in the UK and also the European Union are a lot stricter, though. So I personally would trust food much more over there than in the US. Here, I always buy organic. I know that that's very prohibitive from a cost perspective for many people, but I would still say if you can do it, if you can't, it's still better than ultra processed foods. I try to buy locally from local farms, etc. Trying my best. I accept that some will slip through. I'm very particular. I noticed when I'm out of the US, I made videos about this, I feel better, I feel clearer, and I think it's more than just a vacation. I'm quite in tune with my body, and I notice when I'm back in the US, I start to not feel as good, as clear, and I'm sure some of this toxic junk is slipping through, and it's horrible that millions of people have no other choice.
Indeed, and as you say, particularly poorer people who need to fill themselves up. And as you mentioned before, if you fill yourself up with biscuits and ultra-processed food, you're getting all these food components we don't want. But very importantly, you're also missing out on a lot of nutrients that we do need. You mentioned there that some of your patients come in who have obesity but low albumin levels, which of course is the protein in the blood, indicating these people don't probably have enough protein because there are essential amino acids. We need these 10 essential amino acids out of the 20 to maintain normal health. And if we're not getting those, we're low on protein. There's essential fatty acids that we also need. And other things that people are often short of, even in our affluent Western countries, things like the water-soluble vitamins B and C, people can be low on. And of course, vitamin D we know about quite a lot because we don't get enough natural sunshine. And I suspect a lot of people are actually quite low in iodine as well, which is essential, of course, for the development of the nervous system. So it could well be that we have a generation of young people who don't have enough iodine to facilitate normal development of the nervous system. And as soil is more and more exhausted, we just pile in more fertilizers and we can get the crops growing up again. But then we're taking out the trace elements from the soil. That becomes exhausted. So the magnesium, the zinc, the selenium. I mean, we know selenium is an important antioxidant. We know that magnesium is vital for cardiovascular health, and zinc, a lot of good evidence that it's good for prostate health, and of course essential for wound healing. I mean, do you think we're kind of seeing a double pandemic, as it were, of overnutrition and undernutrition? And is there any particular nutritional deficiencies that you come across?
Yeah, no, you raised some really good points there, John. When you're consuming ultra-processed foods, you're not consuming real food. So you are going to end up deficient if you're relying on that for the bulk of your calories. I mean, ultimately, we've moved so far away from nature. I mean, you look in nature, animals aren't walking around obese or nutrient deficient unless they get to the extremes of life. They have everything they need and they know what to eat. Nobody tells them what to eat. They know. And we're basically animals too. We're mammals. We inside know what we should be eating, etc. The problem is that we are being placed in such a toxic environment. We're going for these foods, and yes, we're ending up with a ton of nutrient deficiencies as well. No matter what the packet says, the label says, they fortify things. It's not a natural food at the end of the day, sadly. So yeah, all of that goes along as well with the insulin resistance, which is the true pandemic driving a lot of what we're seeing now.
Yeah. I want to think about some specific diseases that are caused by the ultra-processed sort of food diet. So obviously, if we think about heart disease is probably at the top, and cardiovascular disease, what's kind of the relationship between eating all this toxic material and the health of our arteries, do you think?
Yeah, this is a great point because the ultra-processed toxic foods will trigger a variety of processes in the body, all linked to inflammation. And if we go upstream from what you said, upstream from heart disease, upstream from type 2 diabetes, upstream from even high cholesterol, the link is insulin resistance most of the time. So what happens is you consume this food as well as completely mucking up your gut microbiome, which is a whole different topic, and causing inflammation in your gut. It then gets processed. And because these foods tend to be very high in sugars and carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, they spike up your insulin levels. Your pancreas doesn't know what it's been hit with. And because people are eating so much of these foods, your insulin is spiking multiple times every day. And then in the end, you get insulin resistance. And this is the precursor to prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, often lasting for years. In fact, statistics now suggest that 50% of under 18s are now actually insulin resistant if you do the blood tests. And this actually shows on blood tests before even your glucose or HbA1c becomes abnormal. I've talked about this before. There's an excellent blood test called HOMA-IR, where you check your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose. You can plug those numbers into a computer and you can tell whether you're insulin resistant. And because I work with a lot of people to naturally reverse their insulin resistance, we plug the numbers in and they didn't even realize that they were insulin resistant. But that was going to lead to an eventual diagnosis of prediabetes. But your body is trying to fight back often for many years, but eventually you do develop all of the problems of insulin resistance, such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol. I mean, in anyone under the age of 65 who has high blood pressure or high cholesterol, 95% of the time they're insulin resistant. And if they could reverse that in a matter of weeks if they wanted to, or start reversing it, the body can recover and rejuvenate. But that's the common initial theme, I would say, most of the time. There are lots of other processes going on with cell divisions and toxic effects and cytokines, but I would say the insulin resistance comes first, often for a few years. Then you start to see it manifested in the vital signs and the labs. Then you develop the atherosclerotic plaques. And this is why, I know this is a whole different discussion, statin medications, which may fix the number, and doctors get very excited about fixing the number, but you haven't fixed the upstream problem because all that inflammation and oxidative stress is still going on.
Mm-hmm. So you're eating all this sugar, and that is obliging the pancreas to produce extra amounts of insulin. So your insulin is going up really quite quickly because you're forcing the body. And because the pancreas is a clever organ, and it's a great organ, it can do this maybe for quite a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Higher insulin output, it can compensate. But all the time you've got that high insulin output, you're wearing out your insulin receptors, because the insulin is going to work only by binding onto receptors, and people become insulin resistant, so they need more and more insulin to get the same blood sugar lowering effect, and this is insulin resistance. And this leads on to inflammation and all the so-called metabolic syndrome diseases. And I was amazed there. I'm surprised 95% of people with high blood pressure below the age of 65, insulin resistance is the root cause of that.
Common thing, and this is not talked about enough at all. But yeah, you described that very well. Eventually your body can't cope anymore with these surges of insulin. I mean, sugar is so toxic to the body. Your body works immediately to bring the levels down. In your whole bloodstream, there's only about a teaspoon, 4 grams or so of sugar. That's it. And we're consuming, I've heard some estimates, close to 100 grams a day. We're pounding our bodies with sugar. And remember, carbs get broken down into sugar as well. Yep. And eventually our bodies can't cope. And by then there's already been a lot of damage and we're highly insulin resistant.
But very reversible in the early stages. So the vast majority of people watching this, if they dramatically cut down the amount of sugar that they are consuming and the simple carbohydrates especially that they're consuming, the carbohydrates with a high glycemic index, then basically they're going to give the pancreas a holiday. Exactly. The pancreas won't be forced to produce this massive amount of compensatory insulin, and the insulin receptors won't be getting hammered all the time by this insulin, causing insulin resistance. And do you think there can be quite a high degree of recovery?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I see people with type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, who reverse it very quickly, almost complete reversal within a matter of months. But it's not easy to do. And I would like everybody listening who this might apply to, you shouldn't blame yourself. If you're the victim of a toxic food environment, you live a very hectic life, you're used to consuming these foods and you're actually addicted to them, and coming off them is not easy, but it can start with small changes. And that can add up relatively quickly. And people don't realize this is not just physical health. This is actually mental health. Your brain is being pounded as well with these unnatural spikes of insulin. And there is an enormous link. Research has proven this with depression, anxiety, stress. And it all links together with this common theme of insulin resistance, which goes hand in hand with excess body fat and obesity. It's almost guaranteed that if you carry excess body fat, in men it tends to accumulate in the belly, what we call visceral fat. In women, around the buttocks, thighs, that area, different body fat distribution. But if you have excess body fat, you almost certainly have a degree of insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm. And of course, once the arteries do become diseased, we're going to reduce the blood supply to the heart attacks, angina, reduce the blood supply to the brain, transient ischemic attacks, dementias, strokes even.
Exactly. They call dementia type 3 diabetes now. There's such a strong link.
The sequelae for these are just ongoing and very extensive. You also mentioned fatty liver disease there, Suneel. Just tell us a bit about fatty liver disease and why this is so important, please.
So fatty liver disease basically means fat has accumulated within the liver. And this has accumulated again because of many of the processes I described. Basically, there is a process called de novo lipogenesis where excess carbohydrates are converted into fat molecules and stored many different areas. But predominantly the one we're worried about here is the liver. And fatty liver disease can be a precursor to ultimately liver failure. And we are seeing now for the first time fatty liver disease in kids. I've heard statistics, 20% of all kids in the US now have fat deposits in their liver. Keep in mind, a pediatrician 30 years ago would not see this in their whole career. And now fatty liver disease and type 2 diabetes, which goes with fatty liver disease, are the biggest exploding conditions in kids. We have clinics full of under 18-year-olds with fatty liver disease. So most people out there could get a scan. You may have already had a scan, and it's often an incidental finding. We find all these fat deposits in the liver that shouldn't be there. Your great-grandparents definitely didn't have those fatty deposits in the liver, and it's all coming back to the the unifying theme we imagine. But the bottom line is, if you have fat in the liver, it's a very bad sign. It's already a sign that your body is overwhelmed and you're at significant risk of additional illness.
Indeed, yeah. And of course, it's also pro-inflammatory, so you're releasing these inflammatory cytokines that can be circulating all around the body and causing all sorts of other inflammatory processes, like arterial disease, like brain disease. It's pretty bad news all around, really. What do you think the link is? Well, we know there's a link now, don't we, between obesity and certain forms of cancers. Do you think that's mostly as a result of the obesity, or as a result of the components in the diet causing cancers more directly?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both. Remember, by the time you become overweight or obese and accumulate body fat, your body's already become overwhelmed. And again, this is not meant as an insult to anyone. We have to be honest in medicine and science, but obesity is an unnatural state. When was the last time you saw an obese animal in nature? Never did, and it was very rare 60 or 70 years ago. And now it appears, well, it is statistically the norm now in the US. We have 50% of all adults in America obese, not overweight. I'm actually talking about obese. And the link with cancer cannot be overstated, because not only are those adipose cells creating a pro-inflammatory environment, but the sequence of events which led to obesity are also directly linked to cancer. So if you think about it like this, what is cancer? It's uncontrolled cell division. And cancers are forming all the time in everybody. And basically your immune system immediately picks it up and destroys the cancer cells. That's how it works. But something has gone wrong when people actually go on to get uncontrolled division, and then the point where they get a tumor, and then unfortunately it can spread. And if an environment is very inflamed, toxic, mitochondria are not working correctly, much more likely to have uncontrolled cell division. So if you have a family history of cancer, it's really in your best interest to work on your excess body fat and obesity. And I would also like to add this caveat: we're living at a time now where these anti-obesity drugs are being pushed, and that again might be a temporary band-aid. Obviously they work, because anything that paralyzes the stomach is going to stop you from eating. I mean, same as if you tape someone's mouth shut, for want of a better example. Obviously, if you're not consuming calories, you are going to lose weight. But again, you're replacing one problem with another. That's not a long-term solution. People who stop the drug, semaglutide in the US, which is now being dished out like candy, almost people getting it on the street. Already we're seeing enormous problems with that drug. A lot of intestinal complications, obstruction. There's a link with pancreatic disease, thyroid cancer, and I think there's going to be more that's going to come out. So at the end of the day, the only way to really deal with this problem is fixing the root cause issue. And it's taken you many years and many daily decisions to get to a state of being overweight, inflamed, obese. But it is something, and it's tremendously empowering to know that this is the one risk factor which is in your control. There are many things which are not, and that's why I'm so disappointed with the medical establishment, particularly in the United States, which is really pushing the mantra that obesity is not something that's in your control. It's all genetic. Here's an injection, let's make some more money. That's the attitude on this side of the pond.
Yeah, it's a very medicalization sort of problem of what is essentially a lifestyle, or largely for most people, or a lot of people, a lifestyle issue. And of course, with obesity, there's so many other problems. I've listed a few here: dental health, joint problems, osteoarthritis, breathing difficulties, relationship difficulties, work problems. But I want to go on to ask about mental health. How strong do you think the link is between diet and lifestyle and dementia and the anxiety and depression all of us could do with a little bit less of?
Exactly. Oh, there's an absolutely enormous link. Just at a basic level, we've all known since we were very young, if we exercise, endorphins start flowing. We feel good when we've had a good workout. We feel good afterwards. So we can see immediate effects. But there is an enormous body of research already out there that if you're carrying around excess body fat, again, because of all of this inflammation, your brain is not going to be as clear as it should. You're going to be more stressed, anxious, depressed. Am I saying that being in perfect shape and exercising is going to solve all your problems? Of course not. Yeah. But it's all about trying to tick as many boxes as we can. And why add to something through lifestyle? So yeah, those links are there. And we've already said many in the medical community, including myself, essentially call dementia type 3 diabetes because there's such a strong link. That's not saying everybody with dementia has diabetes, but it is saying that, yes, we know that diabetes is one of the biggest modifiable risk factors for getting dementia.
Well, and certainly the insulin resistance is a big risk factor for dementia. I guess your brain cells are going to have either too much glucose, they're going to be in a hyperosmotic environment, or they're not going to get enough. And I know dementia features can improve quite dramatically sometimes when people go onto keto diets.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Because they lose the ability to metabolize the glucose. Now, we mentioned microbiome once or twice there, a bit of a buzzword at the moment. I think we'd probably better say something about it. The way I see the microbiome is in the gut. There's huge amounts of bacteria, obviously, which are supposed to be there, of course, and they largely feed on the residue of our food. So we have two things, and I'm going to try and get this the right way around. We have prebiotics, which are the fibers that the bacteria will feed on, and probiotics, which is actual bacteria itself. So when we eat fermented food, for example, we have probiotics. And some of those bacteria that we eat, the healthy bugs, a small proportion of those will get through the acid in the stomach and get down through to colonize the colon. Do you think it's important to eat a wide variety of fruit and vegetables, the sort of the Tim Spector thinking, that we need 30 different types of vegetables a week, ideally, to have a wide variety of fiber, so we have a wide variety of bacteria and, who knows, viruses and even some fungi in the microbiome? Or do you think a more keto diet where people are eating less fruit and vegetables? There's kind of a bit of a debate there. Where do you sort of stand on that at the moment?
Yeah, so the keto diet undoubtedly does work. In fact, coming back to mental health for a second, there have been fascinating studies that children who go on keto diets reverse their bipolar disorder and other conditions, ADHD. The issue I have, and this is also when I work with people, I want something which is sustainable over the long term and people enjoy. So keto diets might work, yes, because you're not getting the carbs and you're cutting out a lot of the toxic junk. But is it sustainable over the long term? I believe you can achieve the same goals by adopting other common sense measures, including a low carbohydrate diet. The microbiome is a super fascinating area, and this again is going to be found to be a unifying factor, I'm sure, and maybe an initial stage of many of the illnesses we talked about just then, the insulin resistance, etc., as your microbiome is disrupted. So we all get our microbiome from our mother, actually, upon birth, and it is the trillions of organisms, yes, I said trillions, not billions, of organisms which naturally reside in your gut. And these need to be all in balance with each other. And generally speaking, my school of thought as well is that the further we move away from nature, the more we disrupt it. So we've already harped on about ultra-processed foods. Do you need 30 types of fruits and vegetables? Well, I'm not a one-size-fits-all person. Different things work for different people. Some people hate tomatoes, some people hate red peppers. So you can never make broad rules. But what I will say is this: you can have a common sense diet which has a good balance. I'm a big fan of the colorful vegetables and fruits. Sometimes, especially when I'm working with diabetics and pre-diabetics, you want to be a bit careful with fruit because they're high in sugar. So be careful, go for the lower glycemic ones like organic blueberries, for instance. But generally, you can't go wrong with a good array of vegetables, colorful, so red peppers, tomatoes, etc. Try to get a wide variety. I don't know whether I'd be on board with saying, yeah, you have to have 30 types and make it a tick box, as long as you're getting a good variety and you're exercising common sense.
I think the idea of eating a rainbow is a really great idea, because you're getting the flavonoids, these polyphenols,
exactly,
antioxidants, which can reduce the inflammation, which of course is brilliant. And I think this is just just a bit of a ramble now from me. Given that we are basically designed to be hunter-gatherers is the way I look at it. I suspect that our hunter-gatherer ancestors at certain times of year would have a glut of cabbages. And other times of year have maybe a glut of apples. Maybe we should be eating foods in season. It's just sort of a way I think about it. And that means as well, we can eat the foods which are real foods, real fruit and vegetables, but those which are cheaper at the time. So it's an economical way to eat as well if we eat more seasonally.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, nothing that we do that is close to nature is likely to be bad for us.
Yeah.
So as you said, yeah, they wouldn't have routines. They couldn't go to a Tesco or Sainsbury's and buy a whole load of things out of season like we can, which are imported. So yeah, they were doing all those things. And also a lot of people try to make the point during debates that, why do you talk about hunter-gatherers or what people did hundreds of years ago because they only lived till 20 or 30 on average? Well, I think that's a very skewed statistic because actually they were a lot healthier than we are today. And the only reason for that statistic is that a huge number of infants used to die. High child mortality. A lot of mothers used to die during childbirth. There were no antibiotics. There was no good hygiene. But actually, if you look statistically, once people reached 20 or 30, unless something else happened, like they had to go to war or something, they actually lived very long and they were actually healthier than we are today.
It's a bit of an unfair question, Suneel, really. We hadn't planned this, but we know that there's data from the Second World War where mothers in the Netherlands were malnourished in 1944. And they went on to suffer more metabolic diseases and things in later life. And that was actually passed on through their germline to the next generation. And we know the importance of the first 1,000 days. So if we're conceived on day one, then we're born 9 months later at whatever that is, 250 days. And then the first few years of life, the first 1,000 years, is when the epigenetics is all kind of set up that determines the way that we're going to function genetically and physiologically really throughout our lifetimes, and the health of our reproductive cells that are going to go into the next generation. Do you think what we're seeing now with ultra-processed foods, with the what we might call the hyper nutrition and the hypo nutrition that we talked about, it's got great effects for children? Is this going to be lifelong, and could this potentially carry on to become a bit of a generational problem?
Yeah, this is why I'm very concerned with what's happening right now. And as I mentioned earlier, we're only at the tip of the iceberg. And this is not talked about enough either. We have a huge number of mothers giving birth in the US and UK who are very metabolically unhealthy. And the mainstream media will harp on about, these systemic disparities or whatever, but nobody will ever talk about the fact that we have a high infant mortality rate in the US because the mothers are so sick. They have diabetes, their babies have problems. There have been case reports of babies being born already with fatty liver disease. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is, again, unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever happened in history. And these are huge numbers, which have all exploded in the last 10 years. And I'm very, very concerned. And that's why I can't understand why more members of my profession are not literally standing on rooftops with loudspeakers if they truly care for health and well-being. Because this is all going to hit us very hard in a few years. And hit us it will. The question is how much damage would have been done, and can we ever really recover from it?
Yeah, most people don't realise the magnitude of this situation. It's getting worse. It's massively significant. We've got an pandemic of chronic ill health, which is largely treatable. We are almost as if we're puppets of big industry. Yeah. We're being manipulated by people that produce food, not the individual farmers, of course. They're great. It's this corporate thinking where food is being produced in an artificial way. We haven't even talked about some of the appalling things that are going on in terms of animal welfare. That we have to have, we need to have natural animals having a good life in a field. Yes, of course, we have to eat them, but it will also be done humanely. We've got that whole area there. We've got this whole industrialization. I'm really concerned about particular individuals and particular corporations and the amount of influence they are currently buying up over our food supply.
Exactly.
Because if someone does control our food supply, then they control us. Make no doubt about it. We will prioritise eating over pretty well anything else. That is a big concern. And we just need to take out this whole idea that profit is more important than health. And if that means government regulations, then it means government regulations. What we can do, and we're trying to do now, is upgrade the realization of people to how serious an issue this is and how much they can really, I think transform is not too big a word, transform their own individual health and the health of their families. I mean, how do you see the way forward? What advice can we give let's give some advice to governments, and then let's give some advice to individuals. Maybe governments first of all. If you were in charge, what would you tell governments to do?
Okay, I would be quite radical, as you can imagine, but you stated some absolutely fantastic points there, John. So first and foremost, I don't think anybody out there wants to be sick, and especially nobody wants their kids to be sick. So if you frame it like that, nobody wants sickness. The problem is people don't realize the extent to which they are trapped, and particularly in the United States, the system is rigged against them from the very beginning. I believe, wasn't it during Margaret Thatcher's time that there was some famous incident in Parliament when someone said playing for you was like you go out to the middle and you realize your captain has broken your bat. So you're already playing in a field which is rigged against you. So know this: if you want to take control of your family's, of your health and your family's health, you have to understand that the authorities are not going to protect you as you may think they are. They're not going to be giving you good advice. In the US, we have a situation where the entire government is basically bought out by the pharmaceutical industry. Coming back again to my statement about how history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So throughout the last few hundred years, you always had one dominant industry, John. Before, it was the war industry for hundreds of years. And every 10 years, they would make a ton of money by marching millions of young men out to the front lines, go die, they make their money. Some people get more power and control. And then for the latter half of the last century, it became big oil. That became very dominant for a bit. Now it's a pharmaceutical industry, and you have to see it to believe it. I'm sure you've seen some of the statistics. The amount of power they wield in the US, which then filters through to the UK, 2/3 of congressmen and senators take money from Big Pharma. They're by far the biggest lobbying organization. Turn on the TV next time you're in the States, cable TV, which I canceled a long time ago, thankfully, but sometimes every single ad is a Big Pharma ad. This industry is completely out of control, and you have to see it to believe it if you're from overseas. And I believe they are so entrenched that getting them out is going to be really tough. It would take a brave person, someone like RFK, coming in charge and saying, at an executive level, there are things in the US that could be done immediately. There could immediately be a Big Pharma ad ban for a start. That's something a president could do with his cabinet. You could immediately reform the organizations like the FDA, which take 50% of funding from pharmaceutical industry. There was an amusing incident a couple of weeks ago where someone called the FDA out and said, you take 50% of money from big industry. How can you be independent and working in the best interests of Americans? And they actually put out a tweet afterwards saying, no, this is factually incorrect. We take 48% from big industry. No joke.
In the UK, it's 86%. MHR, Medicines Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. It's 86% funded by industry. Yeah. It's even worse.
Yeah, how could these industries ever be independent? And then at a doctor level, now, I don't want to be too harsh on doctors. I know being a doctor is a hard job, but there has to be some collective responsibility here. Doctors cannot just put their heads down and say, oh, we'll just work in the system. We'll have a complete disaster unfolding around us and think that the answer is to throw pills, injections, and do profitable procedures on people. They have to take responsibility too. And I think this would have a huge effect. Every physician society in America, you cannot take more than $50 a year from Big Pharma. If that actually happened, you would see change within a week, because these doctor organizations that set guidelines, protocols, and make recommendations are all on the payrolls of big business. So doing that would have an enormous effect.
It's not about...
So things like that at a top level could be done very immediately, very fast.
It's not a bad business model, though, really, is it? We can produce all this mass agricultural food using industrial agricultural techniques and make some money on that. Then we can make some money from processing foods. We can make some money from ultra processed foods. We can sell that to people and make some money off them again then. And then we make them sick, so we can make some more money off them again, giving them drugs. It's actually quite a slick business model, really.
Yes, it's a merry-go-round, which is why I know so many people are banking.
It's just hard not to be cynical, isn't it? It really is quite difficult. From an individual level, though.
Yeah, I mean, the nutrition scientists who work for the US government are all deeply entrenched in big industry, and that's why they put recommendations forward, getting things like sugary processed foods into kids' lunches across the US. And they say things like Cheerios are better than eating scrambled eggs. This is complete lunacy. Yeah. And it would make a good comedy script if it wasn't real.
Yeah. Right, if you maybe just a quick fire to finish, Suneel, if you don't mind, for the individual. Eating vegetables, good?
Yes, eating vegetables
wide variety
is good.
of vegetables, yeah.
Absolutely.
And
a wide variety of colourful vegetables.
And fruits.
Fruits are okay. Be careful if you're already pre-diabetic or diabetic and need to work on those blood sugars. But generally, I'm a fan of fruits. Eggs are fantastic. A complete superfood. Don't listen to anyone who says that eggs are dangerous and they are bad for you while promoting cereals. Eggs are fine.
Meat and fish?
Meat and fish are fine. Now, the issue again is a lot of people who eat meat and fish. There's a big carnivore community online who experience some health benefits. And the main reason is they immediately cut out that processed junk. A lot of them are all about organic, pasture raised. That model wouldn't work for hundreds of millions of people. So remember that if you're eating meat that is standard meat, it's pumped with hormones, and those animals probably have metabolic syndrome. A horrible situation. You mentioned animal welfare. It's terrible treatment of animals. And I also, even on a spiritual level, I believe in energy flow. And if you take an animal that's completely miserable its whole life, and then you kill it and eat it, that energy, that negative energy is going to enter you as well. So as far as I'm concerned, bad on a number of levels, but essentially people are consuming animals that are sick and diseased. And they've shown this. They've shown meat from other countries, compared it with meat in the US from the same animal, and it looks completely different. It's a different color. And
of course, also from a spiritual point of view, the Bible is full of advice on animals and animal welfare. Don't muzzle the oxen that grinds the corn, and there's so many scriptural reference to it as well.
Exactly. And it's common sense. I mean, I only buy pasture raised eggs. I want the chickens that lay the eggs that I eat to be very healthy and happy for their whole lives.
Legumes, peas and beans, lentils.
Peas and beans are great. Yeah, they're also high in protein. You have to be a bit careful with carbs, but many vegetarians out there get a large amount of protein from legumes and beans. Nuts are great. I'm a fan of nuts. You do have to be a bit careful because they're high in calories. So while I say yes, eat real foods, if you're trying to lose fat, it is going to be a calorie deficit issue as well. And I know a lot of people who will try to be losing weight, but then they'll eat like a big bowl of nuts, and right there is like 500-600 calories. So as long as you're careful, nuts are good. They also contain protein and many vitamins.
Of course, fat and protein do tend to make us feel fuller for longer. They have a high sort of satiety. We're satiated for longer if we eat these things.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially protein. That's why it's a good idea to add protein in as much quantity as you can to every meal. And if you look scientifically at insulin spikes, carbohydrates and sugars obviously spike your insulin levels the most. Proteins and fats are way less in terms of insulin spikes, so they need to be a core part of your insulin resistance reversal strategy.
I love cheese.
So do I. Love cheese as well. High in calorie. I'm a fan of cheese. Again, as long as you're sensible, you've got some protein there, you will get some fat. But again, if you're buying high quality cheese, there's no reason why you can't enjoy odd cheese.
And of course, for every food really that we've mentioned there, There's the real food, and then there's the ultra-processed industrial impersonation of food. So you can buy cheese which looks like cheese but actually isn't cheese. It really is quite complicated. We've got to look at the labels and make sure we're eating the genuine product. We need to eat food, not industrial mush. And and
a great example as well is nuts. I made a video on this, that you go shopping, half of the bags of nuts have seed oils added to them. You have to buy the raw nuts. I'd also advise people to be really, really careful with bread. It's technically the most heavily processed food in the US and UK. Bread should only contain 4 or 5 ingredients. But you look at bread, and I've done this in the UK as well, it's full of artificial rubbish. And people buy the whole wheat and multigrain and think that it's good. But look at the label. That's probably the biggest thing. If anyone wants to start this journey, just start reading ingredient labels, and your future self will thank you for this, because once you start, you can't stop. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
And bread, so often it's got emulsifiers, preservatives, extra sugar, all sorts of things that simply shouldn't, in my view, and I'm sure in your view, simply shouldn't be there. Well, just the last one we'll say, I think, should we talk about beer?
Beer, okay.
Yeah.
Whether it's good or bad? Yeah. So alcohol, interesting, this came up the other day. I'm not an extremist with most things. Alcohol can be consumed in a sensible way. I will say this, in the hospital, I meet a lot of 90-plus-year-olds, and I love talking to these people. And the amount of times because I ask them, like, what's your secret? What's your advice? The amount of times I hear, oh, I have a cocktail every now and then. And that's what does it for me. I hear that story all the time. So I think alcohol is good. Where you have to be careful is, at the end of the day, it's a toxin. And especially if you're trying very hard, say, to lose fat or reverse your insulin resistance, I wouldn't advise more than 1 drink a week if that's your goal. Am I saying you can't go to the occasional party and have more? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying be mindful of the fact it's probably not the best thing if you have work.
And it is very calorific as well, of course. So. And of course, don't smoke, get plenty of exercise, interact with others, love people, let people love you, get outdoors.
Stress, sleep. Stress is a big one. Need to work on those cortisol levels. If they're elevated, you're going to find improving your health difficult. Get enough sleep every night. Work on all of those things. But you will be surprised, and this is a big part of what I teach as well. A lot of people look at these things and they think this seems overwhelming. And yes, it does. It's difficult to change, but I want everybody to remember that you're simply a collection. Each one of us is just simply a collection of our habits. And you can change habits very quickly and go very, very slowly. And each habit adds up. And before you know it, within a few weeks, you can be a whole new person. And your brain is not set in stone. Neuroplasticity is there. And you can pretty much mold yourself into whatever you want over time. You just adopt the right habits and behaviors. And before you know it, you will look back and say, my goodness, was I really that way? With all that excess weight, I was depressed, I was stressed. I'm never going to go back to that. Don't underestimate how bad you might be feeling right now because of the environment
Absolutely.
you're in.
Real change is possible. I've worked with people who've been complete alcoholics who have completely stopped. I've worked with people that have smoked for 10, 20, 30, 40 years who have stopped smoking. I've worked with people who've been significantly obese who have lost and become normal weight. All these things can be done through working with yourself and getting help from those around you. Make it a team effort, make it a team project. We're human beings. We interact with other people. That's what we do. But there is great hope and immense hope and things we can do for the future. Things can be way, way better. And as Suneel said, you can look back and say, what the heck? Why didn't I do this sooner? Really, start thinking about it today. Yeah,
absolutely. Very well said.
Suneel, as always, fascinating. I learn every time we talk, of course. And thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, John.